Good morning again. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee for Herefordshire Council, being held on Wednesday, the 27th of October 2021. For those present in the meeting room, if a fire alarm sounds, please leave the building by the nearest exit and make your way to the fire assembly point in the car park. Agenda papers and other relevant information for this meeting are available for public viewing on the Herefordshire Council website. The Council is streaming this meeting live on Herefordshire Council YouTube channel and is making a recording. To ensure that the recording quality is maintained, please speak as clearly as possible and keep background noise to a minimum. Please ensure that mobile phones and other devices are turned to silent. Others are permitted to film, photograph, and record public meetings, provided it does not disrupt the business of the meeting. If there are any members of the public present who do not wish to be filmed or photographed, please raise your hand now so that any such person filming or photographing may be aware. Only committee members present in the meeting room may vote. Councillor Watson has opted to join us remotely and therefore will be able to take part in the debate, but will not be able to cast a vote. We have a number of people in attendance as virtual participants. Can I request that they use the raise hand function within the system if they wish to contribute? And that's that. So on to item number one, apologies from absence.
Chairman, we've had one apology for absence. That's Councillor Bob Matthews.
Thank you. And name substitutes, item 2.
Councillor Sebastian Bowen for Councillor Bob Matthews.
Thank you, and welcome, Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Item number 3, declarations of interest. Do any members wish to declare any Schedule 1, Schedule 2 or other interests in any agenda item? Take silence as no. Item 4, minutes. The minutes of the meeting held on the 27th September 2021 are included in the agenda at pages 11-18 for approval. No matters of accuracy have been notified to the monitoring officer. Are you content that I sign the minutes as an accurate record? Say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Please note the agenda as published incorrectly assigned questions from members of the public, questions from councillors as items 7 and 8. These items should have been assigned as items 5 and 6. I'm using my discretion as chairperson to bring these items forward to their correct position in the agenda. As published, agenda item 7, questions from members of the public. No questions have been received from the public on this occasion. And agenda item 8, as published, no questions from councillors, no questions have been received from councillors on this occasion either. So we now pass to the main agenda items. Agenda item 7, the progress report on internal audit activity. Just to remind members, the purpose of this item is to update us on the progress of internal audit work and to bring to our attention any key internal control issues arising from work recently completed. To enable our committee to monitor performance of the internal audit team against the approved plan. I introduce Jackie Gooding from the South West Audit Partnership, who's joining us remotely. Jackie, are there any points that you'd like to comment on in your report?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members. I hope you can all hear me okay. So really, I just wanted to draw your attention to several items in the report. First of all, you will see from the front cover that the report covers both 2021 and 2021-22. So we've updated on the remaining audits from 2021 and also given you progress on the 2021-22 plan. The report also includes the Q3 or proposed Q3 plan and also provides a counter fraud update. You will see on page 25 a summary is provided of the work completed in the year. We have also started to add in thematic findings as requested by the committee, and this will be expanded as work progresses through the year. So since my last update, 4 reviews have been finalised for the 2020-21 internal audit plan, and 7 reviews have been delivered and finalised for the 2021-22 internal audit plan. Of the 11 audits completed, 1 had limited assurance, 3 had reasonable assurance, 1 had substantial assurance, 5 were grant certifications, all assessed as reasonable, and 1 audit was an advisory. In the period covered by the report, there were 3 priority 2 actions. These have all been agreed and were for the building maintenance and cleaning agreement audit. These are detailed on page 28 of your report. All 3 actions have been agreed by the Capital Programme Maintenance Manager with target dates for completion of the 30th of September 21, 31st of December 21, and the update for the service level agreement for the 31st of March 2022. Sorry, that's for the specifications of the new contracts to replace the arrangements extended under waivers for the 31st of March 2022. All the priority 3 actions that have been reported have also been agreed with a target implementation date agreed as well. During the period, there have been no significant corporate risk identified. On page 34 of the report, you will see a number of changes to the plan, primarily to accommodate grant certification work. Since the Q2 plan was presented to the committee, 7 additional audits have been added to the plan, and we are therefore proposing to move 6 audits to Q3 and 4 to accommodate the additional work. The proposed Q3 plan is on page 43 of the report, with the counter fraud update on pages 44 to 46. I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Jackie. The Vice Chair's just pointed out to me that we've passed over the audit and governance action log update from the previous item. So what I'll do is we'll come to that after we've completed this agenda item, and just go back to cover that if it is agreeable to doing that. In the meantime, do I have any questions for Jackie on her report? Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just had a question. I think last time we had an internal audit update, I just raised a couple of concerns about the progress and how there were perhaps some Q1, Q2 audits that were being delayed. One of the things that I see in this update is that we've got a lot of grant work, and I just wanted to get an idea of whether you might feel like, because I thought we got extra funding through COVID grants for the grant work. So is there any way that the grant work can be run concurrently with the rest of the programme? Because at the moment I see a lot of grant work occurring, but the regular internal audit work appears to be being delayed, and there are some Q1, Q2 audits that haven't been started, I believe, or are in progress. So it was just your comments, Jackie, on sort of the balance of where you think the work is being done and whether we can get more of that internal audit work, our regular routine internal audit work happening at the same time with grant work.
Thank you, Councillor Bolton. Yes, you're quite correct. The grant work has pushed the internal audit work that we had planned to do back. There has been a significant impact on the plan from the grant work. Obviously, with the continuing funding that's being provided to the council, each time a different funding figure is provided, it leads to a separate grant determination. So as an example, the home to school transport grant funding, which we were hoping to have signed off at the beginning of the year, has had different tranches of funding, and each one requires a separate sign off. So this has definitely pushed the internal audit work back. It's unlikely that we'll be able to complete all the internal audit work by the end of the financial year that we had planned to complete. However, as we have a rolling plan, some of that work can roll into Q1 of the next financial year. And we will be discussing with the directors and corporate directors towards the end of Q3 the priorities for Q4. I have had discussions with the Chief Finance Officer about additional funding, and those conversations are ongoing as to whether we as an organisation can provide additional resource to do some of the more planned internal audit work, as well as the additional grant funding work.
Thanks, Jackie. Perhaps Mr. Ledberow, because I thought we were getting extra funding through the grant, through government funding within our internal audit plan to deliver some of this grant work. It was not coming out of the original budget that we had signed off for internal audit. So your comments on that would be appreciated.
Yes, thank you. For some of the grants, we get what is called new burdens money, which is to pay for the additional cost of dealing with that grant. There's quite a delay in getting the details from government. I'm not trying to be critical of government, but we have a pattern during the pandemic that the announcement is made, the money is sent over, and then we have to wait for the detail of the terms and conditions to come through. As Jackie said, some of those are Section 31s that require a piece of work to do. But yes, we will use the new burdens money as we did last year to address those things, and we are having conversations to swap about the possibility of buying additional resource using that money. But to be fair, to swap every one of their council clients is probably having the same conversation, because we're all having to deal with these additional grant burdens in terms of the reporting and auditing.
And what's the likely impact then going to be on the end of your opinion if the bulk of our work is going to be focused on grant work as opposed to more general control work that internal audit normally do throughout the year?
I think we need to reflect that quite a large amount of the work the council is doing is distributing the grant, so that is an important part of the assurance process of the control environment the council is operating. And some of these grants are not our normal day business, so it's important that we do have the internal audit looking at the processes and making sure that they're appropriate. So I'm comfortable that at the end of the year, the assurance framework will be appropriate. And I think as we saw last year, part of that process is making sure that we're all comfortable with what we've done for the grants we've had to distribute is done appropriately and in accordance with the government's directions. So I'm comfortable that we will be able to get to a sensible position on our assurance.
Thank you, Councillor. Before Councillor Bowen comes in, I'll just comment on page 34. I think of the report we have an additional 6 audits which are being deferred, listed there until Q3, Q4. There'll be a concern if these were deferred later than Q4, I should imagine. Really echoing Vice Chair's concern about some of these audits which provide assurance to perhaps some of the less often visited corners of the council's work. Nonetheless, they do provide assurance to council and to councillors that these areas are being examined, and it would be, I think, not assuming I know what the committee is feeling, but I think the committee is beginning to have concern that we are delaying some of these things for a length of time. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We seem to be going along quite tidily and comfortably, but I wonder, is there any underlying problems you see lying ahead of us? Any things that, though they're okay at the moment, we should be keeping our eyes very sharply skinned for in the future? Just give us a heads up on that, if you could, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bowen. I think in relation to the audit work that we've completed, and particularly drawing on some of the audit work from the last financial year, obviously capital programmes and capital expenditure is an area where we would like to keep a close eye on We've done some work around that particular area, and as you will be aware, there's been a lot of work in implementing new processes to monitor capital programme work. And as such, we've reviewed the progress on that, and there is still work to be done. And in our report, we have suggested a further review is carried out in the next financial year to ensure that everything that has been put in place is actually embedded across the council.
Thank you.
And obviously, the ongoing grant work as well. You know, there are significant sums of money that are coming to the council, and as such, that work has to be reviewed. And obviously a sign off to say that the funding is being spent appropriately and in line with the criteria. And I do see that that will continue for, you know, certainly for the foreseeable future, that there will be additional requirement to do grant funding work.
When you say additional requirements, I mean each grant has to be begged, borrowed, or scraped for, or do any of them come in automatically? And do they come in on a regular basis? Is each grant separate and unique in itself, or do we get them on a yearly basis?
So, some of the grants that we sign off are grants that we sign off every year because we know the council is going to receive that funding. But obviously the impact of COVID-19 has been significant in the grant funding that's been provided. And as such, each additional funding has to be signed off as a separate grant determination. So we have to sample each tranche of funding to sign off a separate grant determination and return to the relevant government department. And sometimes that, as in my report, you will see, we don't know what that funding is going to be. And quite often when we do know, and it's the same for the council as well, the funding date is very close, and we have to do the work very promptly, hence the changes to the plan throughout the year.
Thank you. And what sort of expenditure are we using to pay for all this grant funding and the gaining of the grants? Does that come into our deliberations at all?
Sorry, Councillor Byrne, I didn't catch the last sentence.
Sorry. So I'm just wondering, we get all these grants, we obviously got to apply for them and generally work them. I wonder how much it's costing us to get all these grants. Perhaps one officer can help us with that. Thank you.
Chairman, I'm happy to help in that area. I think we need to make the distinction between grants that are coming for COVID issues and grants for other things. So, as you say, there are some grants we actually apply for, or we meet criteria and make a bid for that grant. There are other grants that the government have given us automatically. Draw Committee's attention to the paper that went to scrutiny in January, summarising grants that were given to this council because of COVID. And at the last full council, I've been asked to provide an update, and I've seen the draft of that. So a lot of those grants we don't ask for, government have given to us, quite often with very specific criteria of how they're distributed. And as I said earlier on, some of those come with quite time-constrained audit requirements, some of them don't. So it's quite a difficult question to answer specifically how much it costs, because it's something the COVID ones, we haven't actually sought them. The government, I think the council has welcomed those grants coming through. There have been costs to distribute those grants, and some of those have been quite significant because we've had to either assess applicants or businesses or people who are claiming the test and trace for the £500 that we pay out for people who have COVID and meet the certain criteria. So I'm not sure I can give you a determined figure of pounds, shillings and pence because it's so woven into the activities of the council. So we are very good at acquiring grants in those arrangements. But I can certainly ask the team if we can provide a summary of the likely expenditure, the historic expenditure we do on the acquiring grants.
Thank you. That might be helpful. I think interesting.
I think what Councillor Bowen's point is perhaps raising is whether the council has received sufficient remuneration through New Burdens money in relation to the COVID grants to cover the cost to the council of fully administering these grants. And that the cost of administering grants therefore hasn't fallen on the ratepayer locally. And I suspect, again, that's a quite a difficult question for you to be able to answer, as I suspect the relevant cost codes aren't directly attributable to specific grants. But if you want to comment, you're welcome.
Chairman, it would be quite difficult to give a definitive answer on that, because the reality is for parts of the council, what has happened, the day-to-day activity delivering the council plan have been paused to enable teams to focus on grants. So just thinking through the business grants that we gave out at the beginning of the pandemic, the majority of that work was carried out by colleagues in the finance team and the economic development team. And the reality is that their day jobs were paused. But I can certainly come back and with a report about the new burdens money. And I think that my position is that we've had just enough money from government for new burdens. We certainly haven't profited from that. And the consequence is that other activities of the council were delayed or slowed down to enable those grants to be distributed.
Thank you for that. Further questions? Councillor Ginman.
Yes, thank you very much for that comment, because I think it's rather an important point that you've had to divert staff time to manage the grants, which therefore means that which would have been done cannot be done until a later time. And I note that government were suggesting this last week there's going to be more in-depth consideration of fraud with regard to the grants. So I imagine there will be even more work justifying payments again, which is quite right and proper. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but it does mean that routine work quite clearly is going to be delayed. And I suppose an indication of what level of delay that might put in, if that is 6 months, or it's probably going to vary per unit, per department, per entity. But I think an overarching guide would be quite helpful, because that takes me to my sort of question that was raised with me yet again this morning. And it's one both for on a general question with regard to audit. And there was a comment made to me that local authorities are inefficient. There was a question of why does it take so long for anything to ever get done and decided? To which it's it can be somewhat difficult to reply, but usually it's because of the needs of the checks and balances in the system that take time. But I did wonder, when these audits are done, how much attention is paid to ways in which the tasks being undertaken could be improved or done differently, such that they might actually be recommendations on improvement of efficiency, and whether that is a normal item, and whether or not, in reading the comments here, whether they're substantial, reasonable, limited as outcomes, whether that actually takes that into account, or if that appears in a separate report to the relevant department saying, frankly, have seen this done in other areas, in other authorities, and they're doing it this way, which seems to be more efficient. Have you considered it? If not, who does that, and who makes that consideration, and who puts that forward?
Jackie, can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Ginman. As part of the audit process, we do consider whether efficiencies can be made in the control framework. Obviously, we have to balance the control framework with the risk of reducing that control framework and the potential that fraud or something could slip through if the control framework is not adequate. But we do discuss that, and when we have the closeout meeting with the officers, there will be discussion around the recommendations that we're making and whether they are appropriate or whether they are actually over controlling a process. So the answer to your question really is we do consider that as part of every audit, as well as considering obviously the risk of fraud as part of every audit.
So if I may follow that through then. So in your recommendation, how would I know that you've made a recommendation that this could be improved in that way? Would that appear as a recommendation? How does this committee pick up, in effect, any suggestions of improvement rather than criticisms or failures?
Thank you again, Councillor Ginman. Well, I'm hopefully the wording of the agreed action recommendation would pick that up. But I would have to go back to look at some reports to see whether it does pick that up or not. So, for example, we also have, in relation to our audit reports, we may make suggestions which would not be a formally agreed recommendation or action for the officer to complete, but a suggestion for consideration where an improvement could be made to a process. So it would be detailed in the report. It may not come before you as an audit committee. And
therefore, the follow-up obviously on that is, if that is then rejected by the department, or if it's adopted, do you note that later, or do you how does one progress this? In other words, how do we know that such a suggestion has been positively considered? Because you're not making these frivolously, you're making them on the grounds you believe they are an improvement. And I want to understand, how does that then feed through to either acceptance or refusal, or justification for not adopting? And how do you know about that, and how do we know about that?
Thank you again, Councillor Jimman. I think the answer probably is that we don't know necessarily whether a suggestion has been actioned or not. We wouldn't follow up on those as part of our process. We do only follow up on the higher priority significant findings, and those do come back to you as a committee on whether the action has been implemented by the agreed target date or not, and if not, what action is going to be taken and when the revised target date is. So I think the answer probably to your question is no, we wouldn't necessarily know whether a suggestion had been actioned or not.
Chair, my point here is, quite rightly, is audit, we look at risk. I'm actually turning this on its head and saying, do we look at how we improve efficiency? Because in a way, risk is the opposite of that, is how do you improve a system? And I'm interested to hear the responses to date, because I think it is one of the questions that certainly residents and members ask, how do you make your system better? What is the way in which that occurs? Well, clearly, if there's knowledge here that is being captured at the time of an audit that suggests ways in which that might be improved, I want to be clear as to how we capture that and then take that forward. I'm just wondering, there's a few nods going on here. Would the 151 officer like to sort of come in?
Yeah, I'm very happy to come in. I think that that's an important part for any organisation to understand how it can improve and change. The council is in the process of appointing a transformation director to deal with a number of issues. But part of that process will be learning from the evidence that we've found and the wider evidence that we can bring in. So we're very happy to swipe anybody's good idea and bring those things into play, because at the end of the day, we face the challenge that we don't have enough money to deliver the services that we need to. So we're very welcome to look at those things. And part of that will be a very extensive engagement with SWAP and the wider SWAP community, with all of the councils and our customers within SWAP. So that's one of the benefits of being part of the SWAP family, that we'll have that access to those things. I just wanted to pick up on a point that was mentioned about fraud. Sadly, fraud is very prevalent, and fraudsters follow the money. So, as I said before, fraudsters have been targeting the various grants. And when we distributed the grants, we were very careful as a council to do those fraud checks up front. It's much easier to deal with that in the application process than trying to claim money back on there. So that's part of the process we have on board. And I think it's page 46 of the papers reminds the committee that we ran a couple of sessions with members over the summer about fraud awareness. And I may suggest that we run those again a little bit later in the year, because I think with some holidays, like we only had 18 members, so I think that would be something to rush people. And we have a very busy fraud department heading things off on that. And whilst we can't talk about individual cases and live actions, but it's a very informative course, and we all need to be vigilant, because we're all potential targets of fraud. I personally, or the council, would council to see as a good target for fraudsters.
Thank you, Chair. I think that if this new transformation officer comes into position in place, maybe it would be timely, once they've got used to our systems and have something to say, to actually bring them to this committee and actually hear what they found. It sounds like a useful task, I'll put it that way.
Indeed, thank you, Councillor Ginman. I think your point's well made that while we spend a not inconsiderable sum on internal audit, some of the outcomes, as you've highlighted from those audits, are perhaps recommendations as to how systems could be improved. It would be not a good use of value for money, really, if we didn't ensure that those recommendations had at least been considered by internal departments. And perhaps we can ask officers to consider how such recommendations in conjunction with SWOP could be better captured, especially, as you say, if we are going to have a transformation director with a directorate, presumably, and be spending a not inconsiderable sum of money in that direction. It will give evidence and possibly provide some easy wins for a positive transformation of ways of working. I'm not sure myself how many recommendations are contained in individual reports. We don't, as a committee, go through each individual audit report and pick them up. So we may be talking about a significant quantity or a minimal quantity. Again, I think as a committee, it would be good if we had a feeling for how many recommendations were coming out of internal audit, perhaps we can ask SWOP to consider how they might be able to pick those up in the broad brush and furnish us with that information. I've got Councillor Bartlett wanting to come in. Sorry, Councillor Watson, did you have your hand up? I can't quite see you.
Yeah, that's okay, Chair. I don't mind waiting, so I'll
That's
let
right.
Councillor Bartlett
I
go
couldn't see a
first.
hand up, but oh yes, I can now. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Oh, no, I'm not. Yeah, thanks for those points. Working backwards as well, I think from understanding whether or not the recommendations we make are taken forward, I think maybe Councillor Balderson might be something in the same way that we do with scrutiny through pre-governance, be thinking about that as well, to look at being able to say to ourselves that we do know that those recommendations, after all that money and all that effort, have actually amounted to something. So that would be good. I've got just one quick question, and then I wanted to again talk about pages 34 and 35, audit plan changes. My first question, I think, is probably more about the language of audit. And so on page 27 of the pack, under the summary for the Revenue Grant Determination Fund, ring-fence fund, we've got that no actions were agreed as part of the review. Now, I'm assuming that means that there were no actions needed, rather than you and the Section 151 officer fell out and you couldn't agree anything. And so sometimes it's just that little bit of use of language. Am I right in assuming that it means that there were no actions needed?
Yes, thank you. You're very correct. That is what it should say, is that there were actually no actions made as part of the review, rather than no actions were agreed. So you're right, it is the terminology that we've used. So I think we'll consider rewording that for the next report.
Thank you. It's just sometimes, yes, clear language is useful. I think following from some of the main points and good points that have been made about the way that we are moving some of these audits up and down the quarters, I think for me, one of the things that I worry about is, I suppose, is in that drift is, number one, we obviously wanted an audit because we've got something that we want to know or be assured about. And so do we, so for me it's, do we know which are the most important ones? So how do we make sure the list we're keeping is the most important? And also, when does something start becoming so historic because it's been moved down and moved down that we're losing its not its importance, but its timeliness. And then certainly some of the other, so for instance, for the one that's been moved to Q4, the quality assurance, including supervision practices for children's services. Clearly, there's a lot of work being done in the Children's Directorate at the moment. So, did this come from ways of working that were, as opposed to when we get around to this, we're going to be potentially in different ways of working in that directorate, and therefore would it then become something that's almost historic? So, for me, I wonder how we know that we've got the right ones at the top of the list, and whether we're actually charting where things are almost becoming, we're just chasing up what used to be. So is audit as timely as it could be for some of these issues that come up on this list, would be my question. Thank you.
I suppose that needs to be answered both by the 151 officer, possibly, and SWAT.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Jackie wants to go first.
Jackie, do you want to go first?
Yes, happy to. Thank you for your questions. I think you make some very good points in relation to the moving of audits. It's not something that we want to do, but obviously with the changes in the work requirement, the grant determinations, with the resource that we have and that we can deliver, they have a deadline to make the return by. So that work has to be a priority for completion. The quality assurance, including supervision practice children's services, we have spoken to children's services about this audit. And obviously, as you quite rightly say, there's a lot of work going on in children's services at the moment. And as such, they are reviewing the process for this. So if we were to audit it now, we may only be telling them what they already know, whereas they've asked us to delay it, to give them an opportunity to put new practices in place. And then we can have a look at it and be a sort of critical friend at that point in time as well, to point out where the improvements have been successful and perhaps where there's further work to be done. We did a similar piece of review with the adult services in the last financial year, where again we looked at the improvements that have been made, the processes, the changes to the processes, and made some recommendations where it could be further improved. So that's the rationale for that particular audit being deferred at the moment. In relation to the other audits that we're proposing to defer, again, yes, it would be good if we could have already completed them, but unfortunately, due to resourcing, we can't do that at the moment with the additional work that we have. They will hopefully be in the Q4 plan, but prior to that, we will meet, as I said earlier, with the directors and corporate directors to ensure that, once again, as you quite rightly say, the audit is still relevant. I mean, every audit piece of work we do, we are looking at the control framework to make sure that there's an adequate control framework in place and that any risk to the council is minimised or at least mitigated. So they are still relevant pieces of work. But there may be, as we do have a rolling plan, other pieces of work that may come up as a higher priority. But that will be in discussion with the directors, corporate directors, and obviously in agreement with Mr. Lovegrove as well, who is the client officer for the work that we carry out. I hope that's helpful.
It is, it's very helpful. And I think as you say, given the good reasons why children's services would be one that was deferred, maybe it's what we need then is just a little bit of definition around that list sometimes, because I mean that's not being pushed down because of volume of work. That's also being pushed down for a very good reason. So sometimes maybe this list could do with a little bit more background information to say that.
Yeah, I appreciate the point, and I think it's always a good point to be asking at every audit committee meeting where we're considering internal audit as to why things have been deferred. The report, I'm anxious to keep the reports as concise and brief as reasonable, because we all have a workload to read them. But I think it's worthwhile asking the question, and it's a good question to ask. I think the 151 officer probably would add, put words in his mouth, that should there be an urgent audit required for something, that is put in. So if something comes to the fore, then conversation will be had with SWAP to make staff and time and budget available to deal with it. And from time to time, those bits of urgent work do happen. I'm conscious we've got Councillor Watson wants to make a comment, Councillor Bowen, and then I'll try and Councillor Balderson then, and then we'll try and come to a conclusion, I think. Councillor Watson.
Yes, good morning, Chair. My question, Councillor Bartlett actually asked one of my questions, but I have another one which actually follows on from Councillor Bowen's question about funding and the allocation of funds. And I know that as a Audit and Governance Committee, we look at this risk management framework and we look at implementing improvements to the framework. And this might actually not be an appropriate question for Audit and Governance, but I think it's one I really want to pick up and ask where it sits. For example, in Appendix 3, you've got the additional grants quarter 2, and say, for instance, a green homes grant. How do we see about the equity of spread across the county? We've got 26 rural wards, so we are a rural county, but actually, how do we ensure that there's an equity of spread for those grants? And do we determine, or do we see where that grant is spent? So like the Green Homes grant, is it spent mainly in town or the city, or, who applies for it? And I just wonder about the rurality. Is that ever looked at in terms of governance? Do the rural areas and rural populations get their fair share? It might not be an appropriate question, but I'd like to know where I need to ask that question, please, in terms of looking at implementing improvements to the framework.
I'll come in on that, and then the 151 officer will probably put me right. I think we would only be we would only be interested is wrong word. We would only be responsible for an equity distribution if that was a requirement of the grant. The question is very opposite, but I think it should be directed probably as either a freedom of information question or a written question to the cabinet member responsible for the area where that grant is expended. 151.
Chair, I'd agree, or ask through the relevant scrutiny committee. It sounded very much like a question that would be perfect to answer the scrutiny.
Yeah, for scrutiny as well. Certainly.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andrew.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does the decision-making process come into the orbit of this committee? For instance, I've heard that it's taken at least 6 or 7 months to sign off the purchase of a JCB patching machine. This has meant that it's missed most of its really prime time for patching. For why? Why is it taking so long?
That would be a question, I think, for scrutiny.
I think scrutiny,
If the
yeah.
process has been followed, I suppose the 151 officer might be asking questions about the speed at which capital items are purchased to budget, but I think it's really a scrutiny question rather than, if somebody bought the JCB because they bought it from their cousin, then we'd be interested. But as long as the process is correct, unfortunately, it's not really a process question for us, I think.
It did just seem possibly a governance type of issue, but I will submit.
I mean, I could take we could take guidance from the monitoring officer on that, or the legal officer on that.
So part of the role of this committee is also to look at good governance and decision making. So if you have a concern about something, then you can add it into your work plan or ask for it to be considered further.
Perhaps then you'd like to put forward a recommendation to the committee.
I would like to put forward a recommendation on those lines, if I may, please.
Yeah.
But I think it's important.
If you could just think of the wording for that, and then once we've summed up, we'll add that to the recommendations list and vote upon it.
Thank you.
If I may, I think that rather sort of covers the point that I was making about efficiencies. As a generality, that's a specific. If we're going to go into specifics, we could all start having a list of things. I think we've got to be very careful that we don't end up with a plan that's longer than the days of the week. So principles, I think, are important, and who looks, and if indeed SWAP are already doing that, trying to understand the efficiencies is important. The specifics, it might be worth pointing out to SWAP. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to go through every single one.
I wasn't suggesting it should be as precise as that, but the general principle of that I think might be worth looking at. That would,
which is precisely what I was suggesting.
That's right, I agree, yes. If we can get together on a proper recommendation there. Thank you.
Councillor Bowles.
Thank you, Chair. Just, no one's mentioned it yet, so I just wanted to say the one-page summary that's been introduced into the report, I think, is a great step in the right direction. One of the things I would like to ask is I always struggle because I never see a summary of the scope of the audits. So when you, I know when we initially had our audit plan, there was a very high level scope, but that was before you sort of went to the owner of the area and really went into depth in terms of the audit. So when I start looking at your very high level summaries of priority ones of audits, I find it difficult to put it into concept and not fully understand what the scope of the audit was. So one of the things, I think this one-page summary is a great step forwards. With what I would possibly like internal audit and maybe 151 officer to take away to think about is whether we could also have a second page which then summarises each of the audits that you're reporting to us with the title, high level scope summary, and then so rather than having all the details of the findings in sort of the body of the text, if it was all in a tabular format like that one-page summary with a very high level scope, I would find that very helpful. Alternatively, if the audit committee, whether it's part of this pack or if it's some way different, gets the one-page summaries of each of the reports, I understand that's also a positive step that you've introduced recently, and we get that as an appendix, so we actually see, because I think some of the comments today are we don't see the greater context of those audits, so it's very difficult for us to determine whether, make very many comments about it. So I would either like to see, or either or both, a one-page summary of all the audits with their scope, or as an appendix, the one pages that are included in the reports that go to the officers, just so we can get a better understanding of the scopes of the audits. That would be probably an action as opposed to a recommendation.
Yeah, I think that might be an action. Jackie, do you want to comment on that, or is that something that can be done fairly straightforwardly?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Shaw and Councillor Balderson. I suppose, yes, there are a number of options. We can either include more detail around the scope and the main body of the report, but I think what you're asking for is the scope that relates to each piece of work, not just those that have returned a limited assurance or those with priority 1 or 2 findings. So it may be better to include scope either in the plan below, providing it doesn't make the table too difficult to interpret. We could include the scope within the table rather than providing the front page of each report, which would make the report that comes to committee quite lengthy if we do that. But happy to take the committee's comments on board about the approach that they would prefer to see, and we can then look at how we can deliver it in the best way.
I'm quite happy for you to take away and, with the 151 officer, perhaps agree what might be the most efficient way for you, because I also don't want to necessarily put undue burden on you. I mean, we've just been talking about you delaying all these audits, so I don't want to put even more burden on you. But it would be more, I would find it very useful to understand the scope. So I think if you're able to take that away, perhaps as an action, and maybe in the next report that you present to us, you come with a potential solution, I would find that very helpful.
Is that something that the officers can do? Yeah. Okay, take that away as an action. Councillor Ginman, and then I will sum up.
Thank you. A more specific question, if I may. On page 38, bearing in mind COP26 next week, it's got climate change complete and the words reasonable with 3 recommendations. Do we know if those recommendations are then adopted? And hopefully, do we have a report back to that effect? I mean, I don't know how important they are, although they're rated as medium. But I'd like to sort of understand that. And the second thing that just suddenly struck me when I read that is we're doing a financial audit. Who does the carbon audit for the council? Do you, as SWAP, undertake the carbon audit, or is that done completely separately? And if so, by whom and who is it reported to?
Thank you, Councillor Ginman. So the climate change audit, you're correct, has been completed, and there were, from memory, 3 priority 3 recommendations or findings, which is why they don't appear in the audit report, because we normally report the more significant findings to you, priority 1s and 2s. I would need to refer back to the report, but I can give assurance that yes, all the recommendations have been agreed by the relevant officer, and a target date for implementation has also been agreed. In relation to the second part of your question, no, we don't do the particular audit that you're talking about, and I'm not 100% certain who would carry that out, but I can certainly refer back to the work we did to see if it's referenced in that piece of work.
Thank you, Jackie. Does the 151 officer know? I believe it's done by the team within the council itself. That sort of not necessarily marks its own homework, but marks the homework of other departments, and comes up with the report. But I may be wrong.
No, Chair. A report is carried out. I would need to check who carries that out and where it is reported to. Not close to those details.
So if we take that away as an action as well, on Councillor Ginman's comments, well, very timely. Just to just make two more comments. The counter fraud update is quite valuable. I think though on reading it, we would all be could be inspired by fear that all these things were happening in Herefordshire and Herefordshire Council. My understanding, obviously, is that this is a snapshot of the national situation, and that we're not looking specifically at how this has been affecting Herefordshire Council, although it's interesting to note the 151 officers' comments that a number of fraud investigations and actions are ongoing and continuing, especially in relation to the COVID grants that the council has had to look after. And I didn't want to leave this report without commenting on the building maintenance and cleaning arrangements audit report. There are 3 priority 2 actions there, 1 priority 3 action. Would the 151 officer say whether or not he's satisfied with the recommendations that have come from this audit report, and he's also satisfied that the recommendations will be implemented in a timely manner?
Thank you, Chairman. And I think I can go further than that. I'm very happy with the work that SWAP has done in their recommendations. I think they've done a very thorough job. In terms of making sure that the recommendations are adopted, that falls into my lap with the current changes that are coming through. So I'm taking on board the line management responsibility for property. So I have a very clear interest in making sure those recommendations are implemented. So I'm sure the committee they will be.
We'll look forward to hearing a positive report when SWAP revisit to look at the implementation of the priority 2 actions. I've noted, I think, 2 actions. One dealing with, well, perhaps if I leave it to the expert and ask Coleman as the clerk to come forward with the,
Of course, Chair.
any recommendations and actions.
I'll
Hang on, please.
Thank you.
I'll look to share on screen what I've gathered so far. So I think I've captured 4 actions, but hopefully everyone can see that okay. Action 1, that the new Transformation Director be invited to meet with the Audit and Governance Committee to discuss where and how efficiencies following internal audit processes are being applied to council working. There was an action around SWAP providing the committee with a detailed summary of recommendations that are made that deal with efficiencies. I think it's been reported that we tend not to see those, but if a report could be made available. Councillor Balderson, your point around a high-level scoping summary being provided with internal reporting, either as a 1-page summary or annotated within the reporting table, which SWAP and the Section 151 officer could take away and work out how best to do that. And then finally, that the Section 151 officer explores and reports back to the committee on who in the council undertakes the carbon audit.
Thank you. Those were actions. I believe. Thank you. Those are actions. I believe Councillor Bowen has some wording prepared for recommendation to me.
We then tear it apart, Mr. Chairman. It is proposed that the Audit and Governance Committee look at the governance aspect of the decision-making process, including timescales of capital acquisitions.
Would you mind just saying that a little bit more slowly,
Yes.
Councillor Bowen?
It is proposed that the Audit and Governance Committee look at the governance aspects of the decision-making process, brackets, including timescales, close brackets, of capital acquisitions.
So I've got as far as it is proposed that the Audit and Governance Committee look at the governance
Governance aspects of the decision-making process, including timescales of capital acquisitions. So again,
hopefully I've captured it. So it is proposed that the Audit and Governance Committee look at the governance aspects of the decision-making processes, including timescales of capital acquisitions.
Thank you.
Can I,
You could do anything like with this.
yeah, well, can I just talk around it, as it were? Because
Improve it, please.
well, I think it's, I mean, I think the proposal really should be that the 151 officer consider what we're looking for, I think, is a report on whether these processes are timely and
Slow, clumsy, and generally.
so that is not a piece of work that we're likely to carry out with our sort of shirt sleeves rolled up ourselves. So it's likely to be a requirement for internal audit to do. But I think if we're asking internal audit to do that, we need to consider how they do that in within the current work programme. So Councillor Balderson probably got some.
Yeah, I just probably like to ask Jackie, because I know we just did a capital programme audit where we had reasonable assurance, so whether that was actually already, going back to my scope point, whether that was included in the scope of that project, or whether it can be injected into another capital programme audit that might be within.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern that's raised by Councillor Owen is very valid. I think the concern is this just a one-off instance, or is this something that is endemic to the purchase of items of plant and equipment and other things?
Yeah, I would say it's probably endemic and.
Well,
we just
the question really then is, how do we find out whether or not it's endemic? We won't find that out by looking at specific projects or items. It's much broader scope. Perhaps the recommendation is that the 151 officer considers the concerns of the committee in relation to timescales and governance of capital purchases and reports back to committee on appropriate
improvements,
an appropriate proposal to investigate the matter. But that's
sorry, got slightly tangled up just there. So
that's a shame. I was on the roll. The 151 officer considers the concerns of the committee in relation to timescales and governance of capital and timescales of capital purchases. We'll leave it as broad as that. And requests that the 151 officer considers appropriate actions to reassure the committee
in
relation to this.
Yes, or to improve the methods used.
Excellent assumption.
Yeah. So I think that we're sort of asking for a piece of work, but I think it's fair that the 151 officer considers how that might be best included within an audit process, and in doing that, he makes a cursory piece of work within the financial management team might well come up with a conclusion that this is a one-off, or this is an endemic problem. That's a genuine. What words of wisdom, please?
Yeah, I just that if we're actually having a person who's coming in to the role whose function is going to be doing this, are we not then going to be able to ask the 151 officer who will be making the report, or the transformation officer, either through him or directly, or will that not actually be part of that remit? So I'm just wondering if we're not duplicating our effort here.
Well,
I think it's worth asking the 151 officer, to be fair.
happy to answer one for one. So, Kate's got a hand up, please.
I was going to suggest that this is it's a wider issue about good governance in relation to capital purchases, and can the section 151 officer in liaison with, and it can be with me, the deputy monitoring officer, report back to the committee in relation to good governance in regarding capital purchases, and then that will highlight the risks and then highlight what should be appropriate and what is absolutely necessary in relation to the constitutional and statutory requirements. If I could suggest that, Chair.
I'm very welcome to that suggestion if our clerks manage to capture it.
Chair, the one thing that is potentially missing in that is good governance always good business practice? Do the two equate? And where we're buying and dealing with capital goods, would best business practice equate to best governance?
Well, we've still got the work. We've still got the relation to timescale. Perhaps that should perhaps we should say efficiency and governance. So good business practice.
That would help me to.
We were talking about efficiency earlier on.
Thank you.
And good governance.
I think that covers them. I think we all sitting around the table know what we mean with this, putting it into both reasonable English and parlance that is reasonable for a recommendation. So that the 151 officer considers the concerns of the committee in relation to efficiency and governance purchases and requests the section 151 officer with the deputy officer considers appropriate actions to reassure the committee in relation to what constitutes good governance. We're repeating ourselves out.
I think.
Well, I'd be inclined to just knock out the last bit, call it to reassure the committee as to current practice.
Yes.
As the current and future practice, perhaps.
Well,
Current practice, and then we can.
I think future follows from it.
So I
That's
think
a very
what
big
comes
task.
out of that.
Yeah, otherwise it's going to be.
It's a life's work.
We do want to get this.
Considers appropriate actions to reassure the committee needs to come out from the last bit, because we've already got.
Chair, you may have missed the last gem from the 151 officer, which was, if you're not careful, this will become a lifetime's work.
Well, keep you employed, you know. Next 15 years, whenever it is the
So let me just read that again. So concerns the committee in relation to efficiency and governance, capital purchases, and request with the document officer. Reports on
Current practice.
reports on current practice. Thank you.
And any improvements that should be made.
And make any recommendations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
Just to redesign the camel.
Right.
Apologies.
So that's, I think, the only recommendation that's coming out. We've got the actions that we've happy with. We've got within the report, we've got 4 recommendations that we need to vote on. Recommendation A, performance against approved plan be reviewed and areas improvement identified. We'll put some actions in for that. We consider the assurance provided in the recommendation report makes commenting on its content if necessary. I think we've done that. That's 151 officers specifically in regards to the priority 2 actions. And C, propose third quarter internal audit plan on page 19 be reviewed and the committee determine any recommendation it needs to make regarding the level and range of activity proposed in order to work carried out making a satisfactory level of assurance of the council's corporate governance arrangements. We've spoken about some concerns about delaying some activity and asked for actions to be taken in order to determine what funding might be available to include these activities. But
Was the funding in the action?
was the funding in the action list? I believe it was. Right. Can we just put that in? But we did make. I think we talked about. What we did talk about the funding that comes from the new burdens money and whether it was adequate and whether if that new burdens money actually covered all the additional work, whether funding was available then to expedite things which were being put into quarter 3 and quarter 4. And to note the corporate 4 update. Is everybody content with that? If so, say aye.
No.
Thank you. And now my apologies because I missed the opportunity to comment on the Audit and Governance Action Log update, which is included as the last page of the minutes. And I know the Vice Chair wants to comment on that. So if we can just go back to that, Mr. Bolton.
Happy to kick off discussions on this. I guess one of my concerns is that there are some that are past due date. There are a number that require actions to be updated, update required, and there are a number with no due date. So I'm just conscious that we didn't look at it last meeting, and it doesn't appear to be as up to date as possible. So wanted to raise that.
John.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Bolton. Still playing a little bit of catch up with the action list. It is on my radar to update it so that when we get to the November meeting, we should have a fully updated list, hopefully with all of the dates and the actions updated to reflect the current situation. I am aware that there's at least one date on there that has now passed. So we are working with the officers to get the updates from them as efficiently as possible.
I think in the November meeting we deal with risk again. I think commenting on there's obviously a risk in actions not being undertaken. So I don't know. We have in front of us what we have in front of us. I think we'd all welcome a more complete report coming from officers. Any other comment from the committee on this? Well, we'll leave it at that, and we'll obviously need to spend some time on it in the November meeting, which isn't that far away. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to give a 5-minute intermission. That's just top up water and things like that.
I will give yes, if everybody's looking at me. 5 minutes if you want it. Yep. So reconvene at 11:35. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll make a start on item 6 on our agenda, Audit and Governance Committee Effectiveness and Performance Skills Matrix. This item has been in consideration creation for some time. The purpose of it is to consider and agree the audit of governance skills matrix and to seek the agreement of all audit and bill governance committee members to participate in the skills matrix audit. And I'll ask John Coleman, Democratic Services Manager, to present the paper to us. The paper reflects a great deal of work done by Councillor Alderson, who I'm sure will want to comment on it. But I know it's a paper close to all our hearts in terms of reflecting the particular skills makeup required or ideally required to serve on our committee. John.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, and absolutely. Yeah, thanks to Councillor Alderson, who's done an awful lot of work behind the scenes in helping to prepare this report. So thank you very much for that. As Chair has mentioned, this is a report that is asking you to consider the skills matrix as part of audit and governance going forward, and to seek members' agreement to take part in the skills matrix audit. All local authorities in the UK are required to keep their accounts in accordance with proper accounting practices, and public sector organisations responsible for locally delivered services are required by legislation to comply with the terms Code of Practice on Local Authority Accounting in the UK, or the developed by the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountability, or CIPFA. Further, the H&M Treasury Audit Committee advocates that audit committees undertake and agree the skills required for committee effectiveness. Now, as I understand, this committee hasn't actually undertaken any such skills matrix previously, and so this paper is advocating that a skills matrix is considered, and that the committee members undertake to become involved with that. The report or the skills matrix covers three areas, I would say, principally. It's looking at trying to understand the core knowledge of the committee membership, to focus on organisational knowledge, the functions of the committee, external audit for treasury management and values of good governance. Looking at specialist knowledge, accountancy, ICT systems and applications, risk, legal frameworks and programme and project management, and then looking at core skills as well, which is relating to strategic thinking, questioning skills, meeting management, objectivity, and areas for retaining and development. I think it's important to say that what this isn't is about trying to understand where there are deficits necessarily in committee members' current skills, but to really identify gaps and then start to look at how those gaps can be addressed, either through training or through development, or whether or not it aids the committee in identifying perhaps expert witnesses to come in and look at specific areas of works where areas of expertise currently don't exist in the committee. I think that's probably all I'd like to say about the I'd like to say about the report, and open chair to the committee to ask questions.
So, committee, do we have any questions on the report or the appendix which encompasses the skills matrix? I think we've spoken about previously about the broad range, and well, the skills matrix is sort of spread into two areas. One's a sort of broad range of skills, and the other deals with specific skills which relate to the statutory responsibilities that this committee really has heaped on its shoulders by government, I suppose. I'm keen that the matrix sort of provides us with, if you like, that kind of training needs analysis, which might indicate where some additional training on specific areas, new legislation, of changing legislation, might help us understand our work better. And also it might lead to some evidence. We speculated in the past, I think, about whether an independent member with specific specialist competency or specific specialist skills might be an appreciated addition to our member. I think this might also help evidence whether or not that's the case. I don't know, I'd invite Councillor Balderson, who's had such a part to play in preparing this, if she'd want to comment at all on the document.
I don't think I really made comments. I think both yourself and John eloquently sort of summarised it. I think coming out of rethinking governance, though, we did identify that committees across the board within the council could operate more effectively if the members better understood what background or knowledge or what was specifically required of them. And I think this, we are quite a technical committee, so I think this goes some way to articulating that. I don't, as being mentioned, it's really member development. I think it's really important that we have a breadth of skills on the committee. So, not everyone should be accountants, or, there needs to be people that have children's background or adults background, and because that, gives that balance to all the services that we oversee from the audit and governance perspective within the council. But it would be helpful if we had some members with some of this background. So understanding that and understanding the balance then puts us in a much better, I think, position to kind of take our role and do it as effectively and efficiently as possible.
Councillor Bowen.
I'm not going to say anything controversial. No, I think it's a very interesting report, and it does obviously require super men and women to be on this committee and to be involved in it, and it takes time to be one of those, I think. One thing I think is important is the breadth of experience. If you're not a specialist in accounting or other activities, I think to have had a wide-ranging experience, and perhaps not just in the council but in other matters as well, is probably a very useful part of your skill kit, really. Because I'm just looking back, I've been a board member of housing associations and a couple of charities that I've chaired, and all sorts of other things, and you learn, each one of them brings you extra information and skills and experiences, and I think that's terribly useful. So I think that I would like to say that experience is almost as useful as having specialist knowledge. Allied specialist knowledge, of course. Oh, wonderful. And this is great. But I would advocate a lot of general skills.
Thank you, Councillor Bowen. I think that's useful comment. I think the matrix would also become useful for the sort of new members, or indeed as we found ourselves at the beginning of this sort of demonstration, effectively all new members on the committee, and some of them not familiar with council working at all, that it also gives some steer as to areas of knowledge that they might want to gen up on in terms of the regulatory sort of requirements of this committee, which is, as I say, has quite a lot of sort of red tape that we have to wade through, and we have to provide assurance to council on. Councillor Bartlett, you're looking at me. I'm not sure whether that was a raised hand.
I was going to put my hand up, yes, when you finish.
Yeah, please do contribute.
Thanks. And yes, I agree. And yes, it was interesting, alluding to the 2019 good opportunity to realise that you can't just rest on your laurels and think that everybody's ticking along and we'll automatically know. So thank you, Christy, for doing all this work. It's really useful. I am very supportive of this. I see this as the first step because obviously there's no doing it protocol here or when we're doing it, and that needs to come once we've agreed to do it, presumably. So I see this very much as a first step on the way, and being mindful of the fact that I came into audit in May this year. So mindful of the fact that this is an ongoing process and not a one-off thing that we do at the beginning of four years or something like that. And it would, for me, one of the interesting things that comes out of it with the specialist knowledge and talking about maybe a co-option is, do we see a need then? Would we then be identify a need for a co-option? And that would be quite useful. And certainly the constitutional ability to do that. So, which made me also wonder whether on that particular section, we might want to reference the Constitution or something to say what a co-option is or why we would want to do that. But I see very much this as the very first step, and the matrix is very good. And now the next step is to decide how, when, how often. And like you say, it's not about marking people down, it's about identifying skills and opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Jim.
Yeah, thank you, and a big thank you to Councillor Mollison for her input into this. On first reading, it sort of was, should I send my resignation in now? Because it was quite intimidating, and then I realised it's probably been written by somebody who'd got audit and accountancy and knowledge in the first place, and therefore if I substituted with knowledge, the word knowledge with awareness of, I might feel a little more comfortable. If the word knowledge was there in every case, I was thinking, if I was being tested at the relevant level, would I pass? And there would be a bit of a question mark. And I think the comment that Councillor Bowen just made about experience is also relevant. There is a potential clash in this between having politically based numbers on a committee and having experience. And I think that's something that needs to be considered here, because if one is looking for the relevant skill set, it may be at any one time not particularly found within any one particular political party or grouping, but might be profoundly found within one or other political party or grouping. And I think that is a question in itself that perhaps has not been posed in this, but is one which we will pass to those looking at governance and the Constitution to consider. You know, are all committees ones that should always be based upon political affiliation? Or when does skill set actually become more dominant and more important? With those sort of comments aside, I decided in the meantime I probably wouldn't submit my resignation on the grounds that I thought probably I could tick some of the boxes on the same ground as Councillor Bowen, that a considerable knowledge in financial or working in businesses and in currently trusteeship and chairmanship of major charities, actually on a major charity, certainly puts me in the position of saying I have some knowledge, some awareness, but the gap is undoubtedly shown by my inability to fill every single one of those boxes adequately.
Thank you. Councillor Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Jim has echoed all of what I was going to say in actual fact as this has come out. Christy, a lot of work put into it. Impressed, I have to say that. But this very much smacks of a job description in a way. which you're outlining the way it should be done for individuals. And the document itself, I think, is good. And it's something that should be developed and put to group leaders when there is an election to find out where the skills are across the individuals within their own groups. There are things on here, like Councillor Jim, and I thought to myself, oh crikey, what am I going to do here? Shall I resign? The answer to that question is I will learn. But there are people better suited out there probably to do these roles. And it'll be the same across all committees. Some people have got skills in different areas. And this really, to me, is a base which we've got to take on board, move forward with it, but look at it across the whole of the council. Because the leaders of the parties, representations, must know the skills of their members and put them in the right places. And as Councillor Jimmon said, proportional representation is a barrier to having some people in the right places. I, as a councillor, was elected after the main election. I came in on a by-election. And person came to me and said, there's a gap on audit and governance, I'd like you to go on that committee. That's fine. At the time, I didn't know what audit and governance was. I was told it's all to do with figures. You'll love that because I have a background in sort of part of that anyway. But it's taken me time to learn. And I don't say something unless I feel I can contribute to things. But there's a lot of things in here that everybody in the room can contribute to. The most skilled person is Christy, but we can all learn and we can all develop. And as Councillor Bowen said, from that point of view, there are lots of good things in all of us. But it needs to be made clear to all the people, all the group leaders, this is what we should be looking at. Then say, right, I've got 20 people in my group, 10, 5, whatever, who are the best people to put in the best places. Not just say, yeah, I'll do this, I'll do that, which often happens within local government. So I welcome this. I think the work you've put in, Christy, is amazing. It really is to get that in there. But this is something, as Councillor Barton said, we can develop and take further and get it into all the committees and get people to get a wider understanding of the council and the council roles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Bolter. Yeah, I think we'll all echo that. The requirements for proportional representation on committees, I think laid down in the Local Government Act, is one that is always coming to question by those that serve on committees, because it often doesn't make sense. But I guess in some committees it will make a lot of sense to have a proportional representation. But I think sort of less so in the way that we manage to work. I won't draw this out. The recommendations are that the committee comments on agrees with the audit and governance skills matrix, which I think is what we've done, and that we agree to participate in the skills in the matrix to assist ourselves in identifying our own development, and to assist the committee in identifying any new training requirements or additional specialist skills required to be co-opted to deal with a specific subject matter over a specific time period, which I think is self-explanatory. So if everybody's happy with those recommendations, so Councillor Jim.
Yeah, I think there might be one other recommendation that might come from this, that when it's developed, it actually would be something that would always be given to a new audit committee member, because it would immediately allow them to understand. They'd need some guidance on how to fill it in. And I think there probably needs to be some guidance notes that are attached to this as to what does knowledge mean, etc. We'd need to try to understand that. But I think it would actually be really helpful in the formation, as has been suggested indeed, that it's given to party leaders, group leaders. And I think that was an excellent suggestion, but I think it's also very important that new members themselves then fill it in on that basis.
Chair, could I respond to that briefly? That's true, and I think that's the point I was making. This is not it. This is just the this is just for agreeing to do it. There's a huge piece of work that would need then to be going. When are you going to do it? How often are you going to do it? When do you do it? Do you do it when you're substituting? Would you just do the skills audit once? Are we going to have refresher courses? All of that detail is missing. And which is why I haven't come up with any specific recommendations, like the fact that as soon as a new member becomes a committee member rather than substitute, then we would encourage them. Or do we encourage them, or do we insist that they do this? And so that's why I flagged that I felt this was the very first step. That it's just the agreement that this is the route we're going to take. But the devil is in the detail, and none of that detail is there yet.
Yep. Councillor Wallace.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Butler. I think there's some very good points. I think the action for this stemmed out of our effectiveness work that we did earlier in the year, and it was one of the recommendations that came out of that. The other recommendation that was perhaps we did an effectiveness review or some form of report on an annual basis, and I think that's where we would capture this information. So when we do an effectiveness review, if that's what because that's what's rethinking governance from an audit and governance perspective committees looking at, is if we did that annual review, this would be integrated into that. So we would assess, well, this is where we are, so the skills, have we had a change in the committee over the year? And we would bring all that into our effectiveness review, and then we would take whatever actions as a result. So I wouldn't necessarily see that we'd be filling this out on a very detailed basis every year, but we perhaps, once it has been completed for the core group, we would then assess it on an annual basis as to whether there needed to be any tweaks, or if there was a new member, that new member needed to then be captured in for the upcoming year, because then that goes into our work programming. Do we need to have extra training on particular things? So, and I know we look at our work program each committee meeting, but I think we do that at the beginning of the year. Have we got everything captured for that year? And we would integrate it into those discussions is what I would envisage.
So Chair, if I may, that answers my point. That's the bit that's not missing. So for the purpose of this report, do we try and capture that here? Or do we then, what's the next step? Where do we then set that out? And you've given us two prime, the annual report, the work programme. So that's the piece of work that's missing. So maybe somewhere in this, we do need to say what the next step will be, whether that is to go back to democratic services for a roadmap or whatever, or whether we leave it at this and assume that we're going to somewhere along the point have a document that is a roadmap of how we do that through the governance year.
So Wallace, do you want to come back on that?
Right, I think we have it. We have our effectiveness review, which I think we may have discussed at committee, I think, prior to you attending.
Yeah.
So it has been tabled. I think we agreed the actions that came out of that, and this is one of the actions that came out of that. So I think as we revisit once Rethinking Governance has presented to all members and we've taken it to full council, if it gets agreed and we pick up our new terms and conditions, our terms of reference and our effectiveness recommendations, I think that's where the loop will get closed. So I'm not quite sure Chair, please suggest if otherwise, but I think it will be captured in our work programming that we've got to date.
I think it will be captured in the work programme and as part of committee effectiveness. I'm just pondering on whether the recommendation is whether we do put a recommendation in to along the lines of the matrix be developed and provided introduced to new members of committee is a necessary one for us to put it into a recommendation at this time, or whether it will fall out once we've filled in the work. I'm happy to to have that as a recommendation at this time, but conscious that the way that we handle this skills matrix may well be encompassed in the way that we look at committee effectiveness. So it might, logically it's come out of an action or a recommendation from that committee effectiveness review. Logically, anything we do with the matrix should be encompassed within committee effectiveness, which is what we'll come back to once we've got the changes to the constitution. That's a little bit around the houses in a way, but I wouldn't want, because we're presuming that the changes to the constitution are going to go through and be adopted. I wouldn't want this matrix to be not used in future for new members of committee, because I think it's a very valuable tool for them to encompass. I've got Councillor Byrne, I've got Councillor Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Conscious as I am of being a mere substitute, and therefore probably below the salt in a big way, I wonder if there could be a pool of reasonably qualified substitutes, not necessarily on a sort of party or group basis, but just there who could step in, who have some interest and some competence in these matters. Just a thought. And also would perhaps a small booklet that outlines and explains the basic requirements of this committee and of the committee members would be quite useful, and a little sort of, so they could read it through if they were called upon and would have some knowledge and be able to perhaps contribute more fruitfully thereby.
All valuable comments. I think any substitute has to be politically as to, unless they're a totally independent member appointed, needs to be politically aligned to the party of the person that they're substituting. But I think yes, I think this matrix does sort of lend itself to being part of some sort of a background booklet, in addition to what's in the constitution in respect of the role and responsibility of the audit committee, which of course is the basis on which we sit here. Councillor Jim.
Just to point out that recommendation A is that we're agreeing the matrix, and B is agreeing a matrix. So there is a difference between the definite and indefinite article in that regard. So taking on board the comments that have been made by Councillor Bartlett that this is an iterative process, we actually haven't said that we're going to develop from here, and perhaps that's the one bit that's missing in the recommendations, so that it agrees to participate in the development of a committee skills matrix to assist them. And by doing that, it allows us to take it forward.
So, interpreting your comments very valid again. So perhaps it might be that a recommendation is comments on and agrees a audit and governance skills matrix as initially set out in Appendix A, and then committee agrees to participate in a committee skills matrix, so etc. etc. That keeps it as the same sense that this is a what's in Appendix A is a skills matrix, which is our initial consideration, but it might change at future date. Is that your intention? Yeah.
Well, that was my intention, but I was really putting in to be the development of a committee skills matrix in B. So I was just adding those words that we've agreed the principle in A, we've agreed the content as in A, but it might be that we needed to take it further, which is what I think the suggestion is. And therefore, by putting that in there, we're agreeing that we'll continue to develop it.
And for clarification, it's not so much the phrase take it further, it's what do we do next? How do we do it? There's nothing to say, there's no timescales, and that's the bit that I'm missing is where do we write in that we the doing of it, isn't it? It's the timetable of the doing of it, the how often and all that. So it's a small phrases. We've got small phrases now to say that that will be developed. So whatever it is will be, and whether that's a delegation to a monitoring officer or to re-governance or to democratic services, but then it goes somewhere to be worked up as a workable programme.
Well, I think, yes, either a recommendation that the completion of the skills matrix by committee be incorporated into the work programme, or as an action is taken by the committee to meet and complete the matrix. And I rather prefer the action rather than having a third recommendation. Everybody content with that? Just getting back to the wording so I think Councillor Jim, you're suggesting that the wording of recommendation A is you're content with that as it is, with A, audit and governance skills matrix as set out in Appendix A, without any change. If the wording in B says to participate in the development of a skills matrix, committee development of the committee skills matrix.
I'm happy with that, and if the word timely wants to be put in there to make sure that Councillor Bartlett is happy, if we put the word timely in and the further timely development, that would imply some degree of timescale. Getting on with it.
And if we can then say as an action, which isn't a recommendation, is that the committee, I think we've spoken about this in the past, that it would be useful for the committee to meet as a body to fill out the skills matrix. So take that away as an action to be done. Yeah. John, I hope you've captured those pearls of wisdom that you've bamboozled us with.
Really twinkle fingers.
Councillor Watson, you've been very patient. You've not got your hand up, as I can see, and you're content with the way the conversation has gone here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair. Everyone was just saying everything that I needed to say, so I thought, well, there's no need for me to repeat it, but no, well done for the paper, and I agree with everything that's been said so far.
I'm here, so are you ready, John?
I think as ready as I can be. Bear with me.
Okay.
Do you want to go through actions first or recommendations?
What have you got up there? Actions. Okay.
So I think I picked up 3 actions. The group leaders be invited to consider the skills matrix as a framework for gathering information on their political group membership, which I think was the broader generic point that Councillor Bolter was articulating around using this as a framework for
Going forward.
that the committee commit to participating in the skills matrix. And Councillor Bowen, I think you raised this point about consideration is given to producing an A&G handbook for current and future members of the committee.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah.
And then the recommendations, or the recommendation, the committee commit to participating in the development of the skills matrix, and is the matrix and is incorporated into the committee's work programme. Quite sure I've captured that one as you wanted it.
Well,
Probably
I think we were happy with the recommendations as laid out in the report.
Yep. Okay.
Now you've wiped them out of your screen, but with the words within recommendation B, which should read, the committee agrees to participate in the development of a committee skills matrix.
In the timely development.
There's time.
Timely.
Okay, so
Committee skills matrix, so,
In the timely development.
so within recommendation B,
yeah.
the committee agrees to participate in the timely development of the skills.
Otherwise, consent.
Yeah.
Right, can everybody indicate agreement with those recommendations and actions? Thank you. Thank you, John, for persevering with us. Let me capture that. Agenda item 9 then, work programme update, pages 61 to 64. Recommendation is to send update program committee work programme for the governance committee agrees. It's going to be quite a significant agenda, I think, for the November meeting. If it becomes committee that's due to come. To be aware of that. I don't know if John, you've got any comments on items coming in the work programme there. We've got a whistleblowing report, I think, and
Yes.
Both external and internal audit reports, or is the internal audit not the next meeting?
Not November.
Not in November,
No.
but we are anticipating the external audit
And as I understand it, the standards report as well.
and the standards report as
Conduct.
well. So there'll be a lot to consider in the November meeting.
And
And
the risk register.
So,
members will be aware as well that we're looking at pulling in another date for November to just consider the rethinking governance work, which was of interest of members, in addition to having a workshop on that. It's important to note, I think, that November has become busier because of deferrals from today's meeting onto the November meeting. So it will be a busy meeting, not outside of the realms of possibility to manage all within the time allotted, but members will have a lot of business to get through.
thank you, John. Just a heads up for that, Councillor Ginman.
Presumably, what we've just decided on the skills matrix will now have to also be put in there as another meeting. The development of that will be falling to this committee.
I think the development of that might well be a workshop to be scheduled at some time.
For March.
What was I about to say? I can't remember. Yes, so we've got some dates, I think, that you proposed, John, for the additional meetings in November, which I believe have been circulated to committee members.
They have. So the proposal is that the workshop, as I understand, will be on the 12th, and the actual committee dealing with the rethinking governance as a public committee will be on the 26th. Apologies, there was fairly limited scope to offer up any other dates, given the timescales of actually producing the papers for the full council meeting. So the 26th provided the least risk of any significant changes, then making it through to the council papers.
So Bolton.
Sorry, Chair, I just, in response to Peter's point of the skills matrix, there is an element of treasury management that we've inserted into our skills matrix in anticipation of our terms of reference being updated from rethinking governance. So there may be, given how busy our schedule is, it may be useful to have our workshop post full council adoption, so that we are our skills matrix fully aligns to our terms of reference.
Right, so and that full council would be December the 8th.
I think that's the.
So if there's nothing else on that, we've noted those updates. Agenda item 10, date of next meeting, next scheduled meeting is Wednesday the 24th of November at 10:15 a.m. Obviously, as we've been told, there is a workshop on the 12th of November and a further meeting scheduled on the 26th of November. I'd like to thank all contributors for their participation today, especially officers in attendance and substitute Councillor Owen.
Thank you.
Before I close the meeting, can I check with the Democratic Services team live stream has been switched off? We're no longer broadcasting live.